Hello, my name is Kelley Vlahos, and I am a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute and editorial director of its online magazine, Responsible Statecraft. And I have the pleasure today of moderating what I believe will be an exciting and informative panel on the role of foreign policy in the upcoming presidential campaign. Throughout the year, the Quincy Institute has hosted a range of seminars on current events, regional and geopolitical analysis, and US policy and its impact on relationships overseas. But it's been a while since we've had a good old-fashioned political discussion, or at least an examination about the politics in the context of US foreign policy and national security. We think this is an important conversation to have as we get closer to the end of the year, with campaigns in full swing and the fates of various contenders in flux. The second Republican debate will take place 6 days from now on the 27th. It is not clear if there will be any Democratic debates scheduled, or whether President Biden would even attend if there were any scheduled. But what has become clear, whether it be the Ukraine war, aid, or the ongoing China challenge, is that these issues are not only figuring into the discussions, but they are defining candidates and their supporters on both sides of the aisle. In other words, foreign policy does matter. That is why we wanted to get out of the gate now to get our arms around where the fault lines are, how these two fronts, Ukraine and China, will shape the conversation, and what this will mean to voters and the American people writ large. So without further ado, I would like to introduce each of our esteemed panelists today and then get right into the conversation. I'll start with Emily. Emily Jashinsky is the co-host of the political events podcast Counterpoints, the culture editor at The Federalist, and host of the Federalist Radio Hour. She previously covered politics as a commentary writer for the Washington Examiner, and she also serves as director of the National Journalism Center, a program of the Young America's Foundation. Branko Marcetic is a reporter and staff writer with Jacobin magazine and the author of Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. He was also a 2019-2020 Leonard C. Goodman Institute for Investigative Reporting Fellow in these times and has appeared frequently in their magazine. He has also been published in the Washington Post, The Guardian, Responsible Statecraft, and other outlets. And my colleague, George Beebe, is the director of grand strategy at the Quincy Institute. Previously, he spent more than 2 decades in government as an intelligence analyst, diplomat, and policy advisor, including as director of the CIA's Russia analysis team. He is the author of The Russia Trap: How Our Shadow War with Russia Could Spiral into Nuclear Catastrophe. So let's get going. I'm very excited about this conversation. As always, we have a great audience today, and I really would recommend and would love for you to put your questions in the Q&A. We will try to fold some of these questions into our discussions in the next hour. We only have an hour. I know we have a lot to talk about. Also, I just wanted to say to each of my panelists here, I'm going to be asking you specific questions, but please, if you want to weigh in or follow up, just give me a 2-finger, and I'll call on you. I want this to be an easygoing, relaxed, and dynamic conversation. So, George, I'm going to start with you. We've had more than a few conversations, you and I, offline about the 2024 election. You believe this year is different in that the old adage that people don't vote on foreign policy won't necessarily hold this time around. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and maybe just set the table for the big picture in this upcoming election season moving forward?
Well, thank you, Kelley, and I think that's exactly right. I think this is an unusual situation. The conventional wisdom is that people don't vote on foreign policy issues. They generally don't care about foreign policy issues. They care about domestic issues. They care about their pocketbooks. That's what really drives voting in the United States. However, we do have an interesting situation in the world today. Europe is in the midst of an ongoing great power conflict, which has not, at least not yet, reached the stage where the United States and Russia are directly fighting on the battlefield. But we're about as close to that possibility as one could come right now. And the danger, of course, is that this war might escalate into some sort of direct confrontation, and the stakes in that kind of situation would be enormous. And voters, of course, notice this. Our newspapers, our media are filled with stories about this war almost every day. So it is a topic of great importance and great interest, I think, for American voters this year. And there's another unusual aspect to the campaign this year, in that all of the major candidates have made the war in Ukraine an issue in their campaigns. On the day of the first Republican debate, Donald Trump, who polls say right now is the leading contender for the nomination, gave an interview with Tucker Carlson on Twitter, in which he made Ukraine a central theme of his campaign. So that, I think, is striking by itself. I think that means that Ukraine is going to be on the ballot to one degree or another in 2024. But also in the Republican debate, every candidate to one degree or another addressed this. And the two other GOP hopefuls that are ahead in the polls in the wake of Donald Trump, both Ron DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy, are Ukraine skeptics. They are people that are campaigning in part on the theme that our handling of this war in Ukraine has been mistaken and needs a course correction. The other candidates on the GOP are all arguing on Ukraine from the other side of this debate. They're all claiming that Joe Biden has been too soft, too restrained in not providing Ukraine with all the military means that it needs soon enough for success in the battlefield. So to one degree or another, all of the GOP hopefuls are focusing on the war in Ukraine. And then the other major Democratic hopeful, if you can call him that, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., also a Ukraine skeptic, very critical of what the Biden White House has done in this war. But on top of all of that, we have, I think, a very paradoxical situation in that Joe Biden released a campaign video a few weeks ago in which he more or less was trumpeting how he has handled the war in Ukraine, and clearly regards his handling of this war as an asset going into this election year. So that's unusual. Both his opponents and Biden believe that Ukraine plays in their favor with voters. So something's got to give in all of this. And I think this means we're going to have a very interesting election campaign as it relates to Ukraine and American foreign policy more broadly.
Totally agree. Emily, the first debate in August demonstrated that there are real factions forming up in the Republican Party over Ukraine, just as George had mentioned. This was underscored especially by Vivek Ramaswamy, an entrepreneur turned political populist, who said the following: "I find it offensive that we have professional politicians who will make a pilgrimage to Kyiv to their Pope Zelensky without doing the same for the people in Maui or the south side of Chicago." I think Mike Pence and Nikki Haley, who represent or warrior-like, had the most visceral reaction to this, with Haley accusing Ramaswamy of choosing a, quote, murderer over Ukrainians and saying to him, "You have no foreign policy experience and it shows," for which she earned raucous applause. Emily, can you break down where our main Republican contenders are on Ukraine? And if you get the sense that their positions are actually resonating with primary voters, because obviously at this stage of the game, they are the main audience, the voters, the Republican primary voters. Where are they in all of this?
That's a super interesting question, because I think the Haley Ramaswamy exchange was so the contrast there was very, very representative and helpful of sort of old Republican Party and new Republican Party, and we're very much caught in a tug of war. You see it in the United States Senate. You see it in the presidential campaign. Just today, Senator J.D. Vance, someone widely considered to be on the new right, somebody who is well liked by Republican voters, cobbled together a group of about 6 Republican senators, a handful of Republicans from the House of Representatives, and sent a letter to Biden's Office of Management and Budget saying, essentially saying, we need more information on where all of this money is going before we agree and sign off on all of this additional money. And so that type of opposition, which isn't a full-throated sort of Tucker Carlsonian opposition to the war, but is really zeroing in on the money. I think especially the way we saw Speaker Kevin McCarthy react, where he even made the blank check comment that was later walked back a little bit. That tells you, when you see somebody who's a reader of the political tea leaves, in the sense that an establishment politician like Kevin McCarthy does, that tells you he has a sense of where the voters are on this, and it's not where Nikki Haley is. I think Nikki Haley's applause was sort of because it was like watching WWE more than from an ideological response. It was rooted more in the theater of it than the ideology of it. I don't think that every Republican voter is, with, I'll continue to use Tucker as an example here. I don't think everybody is with Tucker Carlson on the war, but I do think people forget how powerful Donald Trump's 2015 and 2016 primary campaign was on foreign policy. He was harping it at every campaign stop. He was talking about the failures of Iraq and Afghanistan. I think that looms very, very large. I think that weighs very heavily in the average Republican voter's mind. And so the skepticism, to use George's word, that is, I think, where the average Republican voter is, not sort of like fully against all of the aid, but not fully for it in the Nikki Haley sense. And Nikki Haley was not just by the people in the room, who I think were probably more enjoying the theater of it, but she was applauded, I think, very tellingly by a certain group of people, voters, but Republicans all over the country who are saying, listen, inflation is really high here at home.
Looking at the polls, increasingly reflecting what I'm saying on stage.
Make a change of tack, because they're so wedded ideologically and political identity on deference to the old order. They don't have the flexible ideology to change course. I'm curious to see where he goes on that question. But the others, I don't think have the flexibility. People who sort of came out with
Biden announced his $25 million or billion-dollar Ukraine aid. He said that he would like to see that as a standalone and to emergency spending bill, like it deserved its own vote, which was interesting coming from Rubio. Branko, I want to move to you. It's clear here that the Republican candidates and many of their counterparts in Capitol Hill, and no doubt the GOP donor class, are ready to help Ukraine fight to the bitter end. Pence actually said recently in a News Nation town hall that if we don't help Ukraine stop Russia, then he has no doubt that US troops will eventually have to fight Russia ourselves. Plenty of Republicans have said Biden hasn't done enough and hasn't given enough to Ukrainians. They don't believe giving more weapons is escalatory in this regard. Biden, for his part, hasn't tamped down the rhetoric on his end, and his administration seems prepared for a very long war. What happens to this kind of escalatory dynamic in a media-driven campaign environment? Are voices of restraint, whether it be from Trump or Ramaswamy and the Biden's primary rivals like RFK Jr. and Cornel West, are those voices enough to shift what Americans are hearing like a drumbeat in their living rooms every night?
Well, I mean, I think it's something that we should be worried about. I mean, in the context of an election campaign where you have effectively a wartime president, and clearly a president who sees, as George mentioned, this war effort that the US is supporting as key to his election chances, that poses a lot of risks for the president to ultimately escalate things if it seems like Ukraine is either losing or about to suffer a major defeat that could be very embarrassing and politically damaging in the context of the election campaign, or simply if the pressure, some of this Republican skepticism about the ongoing point of funding the war and the cost it's running up. If that starts to build up, there's, I think, going to be also pressure for Biden to try and show something for all this money that's being spent on the war effort. So all of that points to the risk that some potentially drastic steps may be taken. I mean, we've already seen over the past year and a half how quickly so many self-imposed lines have been crossed, how quickly the war has escalated, from initially a limited war to help Ukraine defend itself and get to the point of negotiations to within a few months, talking about potentially collapsing the Russian state, maybe even regime change, inflicting strategic defeat on Russia. I think none of that should make us, I'm sorry to say, it's a very disheartening message, but none of us should make us very serene about what's going to happen. I think also the other thing I've been thinking about in the context of this campaign is we've seen public debate and discourse about this war open up a little bit over the past, let's say, 9 or 10 months. I think you had the Rand report that talked about the costs of a long war in Ukraine. You've had op-eds popping up here and there in the New York Times and the Washington Post and other major papers saying very gingerly, hey, maybe it's a good idea for some diplomacy here. Maybe it's not a great idea for this war to go on and to escalate endlessly. There's been a little more criticism of the Ukrainian government. What was once a black and white portrayal, I think now there's a little more nuance in talking about some of the authoritarian measures that President Zelensky's taken to quash dissent. All that about the reality of the war, about the reality of the situation on the ground is important if we're going to be deciding how to go forward in terms of foreign policy. But my concern is that this is going to all clamp down once 2024 starts to really get up and running. As people start to get dug into their particular political positions, as the stance in the war becomes a matter of party and candidate support, and as if Trump ends up being the nominee, and there's a very real prospect that he ends up potentially beating Biden, I think a lot of the center to liberal media establishment will be less tempted to criticize the US support for the Ukrainian war effort, and people will start to, I think, commentators and Democratic officials will start to paint any sort of skepticism or any sort of dissent on the war as tacitly backing Trump and the Republicans, and thereby, in the rhetoric of Trump critics, supporting a kind of undermining of American democracy. And I think in the context of everything else I've said about the way the war has escalated, the incentives, the political incentives to potentially escalate it, that clampdown debate is going to pose an even greater hindrance, I think, to having a rational and, I think, de-escalatory policy towards this war.
Unfortunately, I think that you're right, having lived through many of these presidential elections and seeing how very complicated foreign policy issues are really reduced and boiled down to black and white and Republican and Democrat. And I'm afraid you're right, Branko, this is headed for that. But we have some time to mitigate. And I wanted to ask you, George, you spoke this week. You ventured outside of the Beltway and spoke to a local audience in Pittsburgh at an event hosted in part by the World Affairs Council. While it might not have been representative of the general American electorate, it was outside Washington. It was an outside Washington audience. What sense do you get from that, and maybe some of your other interactions What sense do you get that Americans may or may not be immovable on this issue? What kind of questions are they asking? How much is party politics playing a role? Is there any way to mitigate what Branko was saying about how politics will overcome this by the 2024 election or the primaries? I'm trying to get into the headspace of actual voters here.
Well, that's an excellent question. It looks to me as if voters are in fact moving. If you take the most recent CNN poll that came out a couple of months ago on this issue, it indicated that the American electorate as a whole is moving more in the direction of skepticism about the course of this war and about American support for Ukraine. Not that they believe that Russia is innocent in all of this, but they are increasingly concerned that we don't have an exit strategy, so to speak, and that we could be on a path toward a quote unquote forever war that entails enormous volumes of American military equipment, large amounts of economic support to Ukraine that don't seem to have a very bright purpose of a bright prospect of resulting in an absolute Ukrainian victory. And they are, I think, increasingly asking, how does this math work? What is our strategy for coming out of this with some kind of happy ending? I think, broadly speaking, Americans' views of this war are not very much in line with the center of gravity within the Washington foreign policy establishment. That shouldn't be surprising. I think the views of Americans about America's role in the world, its conduct in the world, have increasingly been at variance with what the blob, as many people phrase it, in Washington believes we ought to be doing. And Donald Trump, as Emily pointed out earlier, took advantage of this gap in his campaign in 2016. He was, after all, the only candidate that stood on the stage and said the Iraq War was a mistake. None of the other Republican hopefuls at that time were willing to say that. And yet, he won. And I think that does indicate that there is this gap between what you might call heartland America and Washington on these issues. And I think the Iraq War and how it is going is, if anything, likely to drive a larger gap there. And the question is, how does that play out in the context of this campaign?
So I want to talk just for a minute about RFK Jr. 50 years ago, his father challenged the sitting Democratic president, LBJ, over the Vietnam War. Now he himself is saying similar things about Biden's stewardship of American policy in Ukraine. He said recently, and I quote, "We have neglected many, many opportunities to settle this war peacefully, and that the way we have conducted the war is bad, is terrible for the Ukrainian people." He says we've turned that nation into a pawn in a proxy war between Russia and the United States. He's really playing into the concerns that Washington hasn't been entirely clear about what American interests are there, and that the prolonged war, much like Afghanistan and Iraq, isn't turning out very good for the people that we're supposed to be helping. Is this going to resonate with Democratic primary voters, do you think, Emily?
Absolutely. I think there's a slice of Democratic Party voters, and a not insignificant one, that's increasingly in the sort of elite, suburban, upper middle class, educated lane that is very supportive. And I'm thinking of the types of people who watch Nicole Wallace pretend that the Bush administration didn't happen and do her thing on MSNBC every day. I think there is a slice of the Democratic electorate that is very much with the Biden administration on this. I don't think they're an insignificant slice of the Democratic electorate. That said, I still think the party, the broader party, because of where public opinion is more generally in this country, and because of some of these deep socioeconomic divides that are now increasingly cultural divides, I think Democrats need to be responsive to the types of people that listen to Joe Rogan, frankly, and are RFK Jr. curious, frankly, or are at least looking at the policy, the billions of dollars being sent to Ukraine, and the stalemate. Essentially, people aren't stupid. They know that Ukraine is not winning the war, and they know that we are continuing to keep the faucet on and to keep the tap turned on with very little messaging from this administration. Again, people know what they're not hearing from this administration, and what they're not hearing is a peace plan from this administration. What they're not hearing is significant benchmarks of progress from this administration. And I do think the fact that this war is playing out over the course of a presidential election, especially one in which most Democratic voters want the sitting president to debate. Most Democratic voters think the president is too old to serve in the office that he's serving in. That's a huge lane for RFK Jr. to come in on a number of different issues, but especially on foreign policy. I don't think Biden will debate him, despite what voters want him to do. But I do think the contrast that's going to come out in the primary with RFK Jr. and then in the general with Donald Trump is going to be very, very telling. And I don't think the Democratic Party establishment is prepared for that at all, because they're in a way that the neoconservatives running in the Republican primary at least understand that the JD Vances of the world are out there. Democrats have kind of increasingly blinded themselves and convinced themselves that voters who are Ukraine skeptical are not the type of, maybe let's borrow a word, are deplorable and not the types of people whose votes they should be seeking.
Branko?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, if you look at a lot of the polls around support for military aid to Ukraine, some of the voters that tend to be the most skeptical about the current administration policy tend to be voters of color, particularly African-American voters. And that is the exact demographic that actually at the moment Biden is struggling with. I agree with George that there is a cohort of voters who really care about the war and see that as kind of the fundamental thing. I think, as Emily was saying, it tends to be people who are already hardcore Democratic partisans, people who watch MSNBC, who maybe read the partisan press religiously. But I think also there's a lot of voters who are checked out. To them, this is just another terrible thing happening elsewhere in the world. They want to see money being reinvested in communities in the United States and their communities. And remember, a big part of Trump's appeal in 2016 and beyond was that he made this point, rightly or wrongly, whether you agree with him or not. His point was, we're giving too much money to all these countries overseas. All these foreigners are taking all of our wealth. We should really be putting that money into the United States. And that was enough for him to win some of these Rust Belt communities and get him over the line. And we've seen a similar thing playing out with some of the discussion around military aid over the past year and a half, where, for instance, East Palestine, that disaster, Biden never ended up visiting it. That's in Ohio. Ohio used to be a swing state. But nevertheless, I mean, that was the mayor of East Palestine went on TV and he said, the fact that Biden went to Kiev and did that major address, which I think for the president was seen as kind of a big PR victory. He called that a slap in the face to the town because he never visited them. And we saw a similar thing with Maui. We mentioned it before, where Democrats tried to kind of roll military aid, which has some declining support in Congress, into emergency assistance for Maui. And I think, for a lot of others, they won't notice that stuff, but I think there are some people that will resent that. And I think, again, there's a large cohort of voters, particularly voters of color, that Biden is not doing very well in terms of exciting to turn out in 2024 at the moment. who I think would rather just see the focus go back into domestic policy instead of a perceived preoccupation with things overseas. So I think that's going to be a factor in the election next year too.
And I have a super quick point to add to that, which is just simply that never in anybody's lifetime, anybody who is alive right now, have the gatekeepers, media gatekeepers, have less power than they do. They're still extremely powerful, but there are a lot of people who are now getting their news and commentary from other sources in a way that has never happened before. And that makes a difference around the margins, if not even more than that. And so I do think that's an important piece of context too.
I agree. And I was going to ask that was going to be one of my questions if we had time, was about the media involvement in the message making about Ukraine and China in the upcoming election. And I'm very heartened by what you were saying. And of course, your own podcast, Counterpoints, as well as Breaking Points and others, Hill Rising, a lot of these online news makers and opinion makers are, they're out there, and people are turning to them to get grasp of these big, complicated issues without having to rely on Morning Joe and Rachel Maddow and whatnot. So this is good. That is good news. We only have about a half hour left, so I want to get to China. Go ahead, Branko.
Can I just add just one thing very quickly to that? That is good, and it's in contrast, I think, to things around the September 11 attack. There's a lot more independent media and a lot more influence for independent media. However, we have also seen a rising push to censor things on the online space, particularly on social media, and not just social media. I mean, several left-wing outlets that report dissenting coverage on the war and U.S. foreign policy in general have kind of been clamped down. I mean, for instance, Mint Press News had its was taken off PayPal, or several of its reporters had their PayPal accounts closed. Gray Zone, I know it's a controversial publication, but nevertheless, because of its editorial stance in the war, which tends to be more skeptical, it had a GoFundMe page suspended. And I similar to 2020, where we saw the Twitter and Facebook censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop story, because U.S. intelligence officials, former and current, claimed that it was a Russian operation when it wasn't. That was clamped down on. I fear as well that there may be an attempt to clamp down on these independent outlets and to sort of shut down their voices if they're perceived to be kind of undermining the war effort, or even potentially the Democratic campaign.
Yeah, and we have to be very obsessive with calling that out when we do see it in the next year and a half. And also, I like to say, I don't want to leave my audience thinking that I'm not being transpartisan. Fox News is another major mainstream news on the right that we now have alternatives to. It's not just Morning Joe and MSNBC. But let's get back to China. And I want to ask you this question, George. One of the things that every GOP candidate on the stage in that debate in August was in agreement on was China as being the major threat to America today, and that Biden has been keeping his eye off the ball in this regard. They want to go after drug cartels in Mexico, in part to thwart the Chinese, who they blame is at the root of the fentanyl crisis here at home. Now, the China issue is very complicated because it splits many of the populist Republicans who are otherwise calling for restraint on Ukraine, like we've discussed. Can you discuss a bit about why talking tough on China, whether it be on fentanyl, decoupling economically, or defending Taiwan, is more of a Republican litmus test in this campaign so far than is supporting Ukraine?
Yeah, fascinating issue, and I can only comment that I find it somewhat ironic that Republicans that seem to be united in the belief that the United States ought to use force to make sure that China is not up to potentially threatening things in Mexico are also people that are saying the Russians have absolutely no justification for being concerned about what the United States is doing in Ukraine. That aside, I do think that China is a very divisive issue, although there is a consensus, I think, in both parties that China represents a formidable geopolitical challenge to the United States, one that is going to be of growing importance for quite some time to come. There is no consensus, I think, in either party on how to handle that challenge most effectively. Candidates that are clear about how we ought to be employing diplomacy to deal with the challenges of Russia and Ukraine are not of the same opinion in many cases about how to deal with China and the Taiwan Straits issue. So this is an area where I think the thinking of the candidates is still early in development. And how they approach this, I think, could well evolve over the course of the next year. So I think great deal of consensus that it's an important challenge, not a lot of consensus on what the best approach to handling China should be in all of this.
Emily, to follow up on that, do you think Biden will need to get more categorical about China being a threat to match the rhetoric that's coming from the right? Also, how much do COVID and supply line issues or overall economic concerns matter to voters today? Do they matter as much as they did, say, in the 2020 campaign when Trump was really whipping up anxieties regarding China on those fronts? How much do American voters actually care about US and China tensions? How much do they react to the rhetoric that they're hearing?
Yeah, I'll tackle that question first because it gets to the heart of why it might be that a war-weary Republican base is very receptive to saber rattling when it comes to China. There is a visceral, especially in rural heartland areas, there is a visceral opposition to China, not on this purely military level, but also because of economic concerns. And it's you go to a town, where I'm from in Wisconsin, if you go to a rural town where the paper mill was shut down or at least downsized incredibly because of our trade relationship with China, that translates then into enjoying the saber rattling because they feel as though they've been wronged, and they have, by China. Now, whether that's constructive is another question. But I do think that is why you see Republican candidates, and whether this is ideological or because it's what their donors want, but I do think that's why, you see Republican candidates who are being lumped in by the likes of Nikki Haley with, they're just doves, is the line that gets trotted out, fundamentally aren't. They want to bomb cartel territory in Mexico, like immediately, and they want to shift to playing nuclear chess with China. And we can have a conversation, the chicken and the egg conversation, about who started that game of nuclear chess with China, but they want to shift focus to another game of nuclear chess, essentially. And I think some of that is because voters have a very visceral sense that China is to blame for some of their very real woes. I mean, there are few political issues more visceral than the opioid crisis, and there are a lot of precursor chemicals that came from China, and that is a very real source of pain for a lot of people. To the second point, Biden's administration reminds me, or the first point, Biden's administration reminds me on China specifically a lot about the Trump administration's warring factions between John Bolton and Peter Navarro. I think on China specifically, the Biden administration has some of that. They have some hawks, some doves, just pulling each other in different directions. And I think Biden does try to walk and chew gum at the same time. I don't think it's successful, but I think he's trying to do it specifically for that reason. So whether that works for him ultimately, I don't know, but it is very, very true. I think Republicans in particular, who are looking at the lessons of the Cold War seriously in a way that they never have in the past, but are really seriously grappling with that. And I agree very much with what George said. A lot of these positions are maturing. They're in the process of there's germs of something that's growing into something maybe totally different. As they're undergoing that process, they need to be very careful about applying it broadly, not just to the Ukraine and Russia question, but understanding how some of those lessons are applicable across the board. And I haven't personally seen what I think would be enough of that yet.
Well, I was going to ask you as a follow-up, is there any room or space for a Republican conservative candidate to come forward and say, I understand your concerns, your economic concerns. I understand your visceral reaction to some of these issues, but we don't want to go to war over it. Like, that is a security issue and this is an economic issue. And it seems like both just slam together and are part of the same rhetorical presentation. Like, it's like, you're mad about fentanyl, let's go to war. You're mad about losing your job, let's go to war. And I don't see any Republicans coming forward and making a case that really kind of separates the two.
You're right. Nobody is doing it, but I think you're also right. There is 100% room for somebody to do it. I think Republican voters need to be, I don't want to say taught because it sounds like top down, but they need to get cues from people in politics in the same way that Trump gave a cue that it was okay for Republicans who maybe had, flag stickers on their cars to say what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan was wrong. It was a mistake. I think those cues would be something that Republican voters would be absolutely receptive to. And I'm not seeing them. Isn't to say they won't come, because I agree. I think people would be interested to hear that case be made.
Branko, let's talk a little bit more about Biden and China. Republicans will call him weak, but his administration hasn't exactly been de-escalatory on this front over the last 3 years. First, how much do you think China will play into both the primaries and general election? Is there any room for Biden's rivals, his primary rivals, to get at him on this issue? And better yet, where are Democratic voters on China? Do they want a tougher policy due to human rights issues and the democratic efforts in Taiwan and Hong Kong? Or are they more wary of how anti-China rhetoric in Washington might be saber rattling and generating anger against Asian Americans here?
I mean, I think probably all of those are at play to different extents. I mean, I think that if you look at polling, people increasingly across the board view China as a threat. I think because of the rhetoric that has increasingly been used across party lines, that framing it as such. And I think Democrats have followed suit. I mean, there's really very little dissenting criticism of Biden on his policy towards Taiwan and China, even though you're right, it's very escalatory. And we might remember back when Trump won power, when just before he was inaugurated, I think in December 2016. He made this phone call to the Taiwanese president, and it was a major scandal. People at the time, I mean, the sort of left-leaning press attacked Trump for it. I think correctly criticized him for, basically violating a major diplomatic line, potentially kind of weakening the one China policy. And since then, I think Biden has really kind of blown past that in many ways. And not just Biden, but other Democrats, Nancy Pelosi, of course, but a number of different congressional delegations that have been led by Democrats going to Taiwan. And there's been very little criticism of that. So I think, unfortunately, the pressure is only coming from the kind of the hawkish part of the right. And, someone who has spent probably more time than others going through Joe Biden's political history, I can tell you that aside from the Afghanistan withdrawal, which I think was probably one of the most politically courageous things I've seen in my life from a politician, Biden tends to fold or kind of go along with the pressure that he gets from the right, particularly if something becomes a major kind of issue or even a sort of, for lack of a better word, moral panic. So I think part of it will depend on what happens on the China-Taiwan issue. If things stay stable, I think probably Biden will just continue to use very harsh rhetoric to not appear weak. If something happens that triggers some sort of crisis, then all bets are off. I mean, remember back in was it last year when we had the weather balloon or the spy balloon? Biden was relentlessly criticized by Republicans for not acting early enough to not blowing up the balloon, even though we now know it was not collecting any intelligence. It didn't send any intelligence to China. But nevertheless, there was this massive kind of hysteria about this balloon. And then what happened a week later? The administration ended up blowing out of the sky several, weather balloons, hobby balloons. At one point, a missile missed and thank God landed safely in the water without killing anyone. But that was a very reckless thing to do. And that was a direct product of that pressure. And so, I would worry that something like that would happen again and that there would be very little pushback. I'll say one more thing, in terms of Democratic voters, I think you're going to get, viewpoints all across the board on what exactly should be done in China. But I think ultimately the bigger point is that I think Democratic officials and politicians view anti-China stuff as politically potent. We saw in the Pennsylvania Senate campaign, John Fetterman, when he was asked what the biggest threat to the United States was, he didn't hesitate, he said China. Tim Ryan ran this very not so much militarily hawkish, but similar to what Emily's saying, very kind of anti-China campaign in Ohio as an attempt to kind of appeal to Rust Belt voters. And so I think, whatever voters themselves think, officials, the Democratic Party, I think, views this as if not a winning issue, at least an issue that they have to appear to be aggressive and strong on. And so I think that could potentially impact China policy, depending on what happens in 2024.
George, you had a two-finger on that?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is the spy balloon incident. The fact that information has now come to light that this balloon was not, in fact, collecting intelligence and transmitting it while over the United States is something that has gotten very little attention from the White House, from the Biden administration. And I think that is illustrative of just how concerned they are about appearing soft on China right now. Nobody on either side of the political spectrum wants to come across as soft on China in the current context. The second thing I will say is that our positions on China are highly susceptible to developments in the world over the next year, including developments in Ukraine. They're not unrelated. Imagine we have some sort of near-miss incident in Ukraine that really causes public concern about how close we are to the precipice of great power war. That could open up some room on China for saying, look, we need certainly to be strong. We have to carry a big stick, but we also need to be speaking softly. We also need to be using diplomacy to make sure that this doesn't get out of hand, because the consequences of that could be quite catastrophic. Lots of other ways you can imagine that incidents might erupt over the next year that would change the political space for debate in this campaign as it relates to China. So I think this is a highly fluid situation.
Absolutely, and this is why we have to talk about Trump. He's, continues to be at least, or at the most, 50 points ahead of his primary opponents. He's not been at the debates, and he doesn't seem to have been affected by them, considering his lead. And we know where he stands on Ukraine. He says he will end the war in one day, and is relying on his ability to get both Putin and Zelensky into a room to talk and strike a deal. But what about China? He seems to have threaded the needle on this for forever on this issue. He started a trade war with Beijing, but always talked about, again, his ability to talk to Xi Jinping to settle their problems. He said last week on Meet the Press that he refused to say whether the US would defend Taiwan militarily, and said that only stupid people would even answer the question. Is he more restrained than others on this issue, or will their rhetoric and Biden's positioning push him to be even more hawkish before this campaign season is through? Emily, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the rhetorical signals he's sending are very similar to what he did in 2015, 2016. He seems to relish his negotiations with foreign leaders more than basically anything that comes with running for office or actually serving as president of the United States. My impression is that it's one of the things he thinks is most attractive about being president of the United States, is getting to broker these kinds of deals. And whether he has a sort of coherent foreign policy, I think his foreign policy is deal making. But that isn't to say it's rooted in any sort of like sense of realism, like Kissinger-esque realism, so much as it is just situational. And that is going to depend. So the rhetorical signals, I think, are strong. There's real skepticism of the blob. There's real skepticism, but does he end up staffing his administration with certainly not John Bolton? There's no way that John Bolton is back in a Trump administration 2.0, but the lower profile John Boltons of the conservative movement, does he end up staffing his administration with China hawks, with neoconservatives in general? And I think it's very likely the answer to that question is yes, that he will still have these internal wars between neoconservatives and sort of neoconservatives, people who are skeptical of neoconservatism. I think that's very likely to be the case. It's very likely to be what we see again. And I think you're going to see Trump erring on the side of his instincts, which tend to be anti-blob. But that's never a guarantee, as we saw with Syria and other cases.
Anybody want to follow up on that, or?
I mean, I'll say, on the Democratic side, there's a little more room for dissent on the China issue, because I think Democratic voters have been really primed since 2016 to kind of view Russia as this all-encompassing kind of big bad enemy that has to be defeated. And I think that does explain a lot of the kind of fervor with which the US support for the Ukraine war effort was kind of been in on the Democratic side, and there's very little dissent. I mean, even Bernie Sanders, who as mayor of Bellington back in the 80s as a socialist mayor, was very critical of Reagan for initially tamping up tensions with the Soviet An and warned about nuclear war. Sanders has been very muted on the Ukraine war since it began. He did an op-ed criticizing NATO expansion, and then since then he said basically very little. I think at one point he even criticized the progressive pro-diplomacy letter, and very few of those signers stood by that letter once it was withdrawn in a hail of criticism. However, by contrast, on the issue of China, I've seen Sanders several times, despite the fact that he is very much behind Biden, offered his endorsement very early. He said, we do not want a Cold War with China. We should be, focusing on issues like climate change, the real global threat that is facing our society. And there's been similar dissent from some of the House progressives, the Squad. For instance, a bunch of them voted against the anti-China committee, House committee. There was a recent bill that was basically about reviewing some of the restrictions on diplomatic contacts with Taiwan. The Squad voted against that as well. So there's a little more room for dissent. And I would hope that that means that as the campaign heats up, that Democrats and progressives will be more willing to speak out, because this issue has not become such a kind of party polarized thing. I will say, on the other hand, to give you the more pessimistic view of this, because of the fact that every Democrat has really just come up for Biden. I mean, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez endorsed him to a lot of controversy on the left. People thought that she should have tried to get some concessions out of him, but instead she just went right out the gate to endorse him. And because of the Democratic and the left-wing opposition to Trump, because of the fear that he may win again, my worry is that dissent will also go away, because it will become, the overriding priority we just have to get Biden back into office, and that means we should not criticize anything he's doing, even if it is tapping up teachers to China. So those are. I'm giving you a wishy-washy answer here, but I think those are the kind of two possibilities here that we should, I guess, be on guard for.
So we have 1 minute left. I just wanted to ask you quickly, like in a lightning round, what are you looking at as reporters and analysts, like in the next, say, 6 months out, in terms of the campaigns, Democrat, Republicans, and foreign policy? What are the key indications maybe of how Russia and China might be shaping this campaign in the long term? I'll start with Emily.
Very quickly, I'm looking at Mexico, because I think it's a great example into how people are thinking about both Russia and China and the Republican primary field. That's if you're turning immediately to neoconservative, trigger-happy solutions to the fentanyl crisis because of problems in China, because of high gas prices that are downstream of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, then if that's your solution to the problem, it's a pretty good insight into where Republicans are going.
Branko?
I mean, I'm always, reading about this war in Ukraine constantly and looking at coverage of it. And I'll be looking at to what extent is there dissenting opinion allowed in some of these pages? To what extent are we hearing, some unfortunate or hard truths about the war or the Ukrainian position? Because, you remember for the first year, it was a very kind of triumphalist narrative, very little the kind of pour cold water on the Ukrainian prospects of victory was allowed to be written or mentioned. Like I said, that's opened up a little bit. So if you continue to see people talking about diplomacy, continue to hear perhaps certain critical coverage of Zelensky and even how the war effort is going, that to me suggests that the room for dissent continues to open up. If, on the other hand, some of that starts to disappear, we start to get a lot more of the kind of jingoistic style coverage, and also if some of the news around online censorship of dissenting opinion on the war, if that starts to ramp up, then I think I'll start getting worried, and I'll assume that my prediction that debate is just going to clamp down, and the issue of foreign policy, at least in the Ukraine war, is going to become a party issue. I think that will have become fact.
George, you get the last word.
Well, very quickly, I think that the campaign positions are much less likely to affect U.S. policy toward Russia and China, for example, than it is the other way around. Events in the world, events on the ground in Ukraine, events surrounding Taiwan are more likely to shape the campaign positions in the election year. So I view this as a very fluid environment, and that's something that will be fascinating, if not somewhat terrifying to watch.
Well, thank you, everybody. I want to point out and put a plug in for responsiblestatecraft.org, where you can find many of Branko's great articles on Ukraine. He's been writing quite a bit for us, and George as well. And Emily, I hope you'll write for me someday. I would love to have your stuff on Responsible Statecraft. Before I sign off, I just wanted to say that there are a few other events that Quincy is hosting online events coming up. We have 2 book talks, one on September 25th, The Baltic States and Baltic Security and Historical Context, a discussion of Charles Clarke's new book, and also Russia's Foreign Policy Change and Continuity in National Security. That's on October 3rd. That's a discussion of Andrei Sagnanov's new book, Russia, Foreign Policy Change and Continuity. And then on the 27th, we have a forum entitled Bankers and Bombs, How Venture Capital and Private Equity Are Feeding the Military Industrial Complex. That's going to be a great one. So for all the information and links and all that, please go to quincyinst.org on our events page. And thank you to our great audience. I'm so sorry for not being able to get to Q&A today. We're going to have to continue this conversation. Obviously, we'll have another 1 or 2 or 3 during the campaign season. And I hope everyone has a great weekend.